Welcome to another insightful edition of the Professional Hypnotherapist podcast. The following is a recording of the late and great, much esteemed and loved Professor Ivor Browne. The recording is from the AGM of the Institute of Clinical Hypnotherapy and Psychotherapy Graduates Association in 2015, and is now known as the European Association of Professional Hypnotherapists, and that's EAPH.ie. Today we delve into the expansive realm of psychotherapy with none other than Professor Ivor Browne, a pioneer in the field. This episode is a profound exploration of the very essence of psychotherapy, challenging the conventional views and advocating for a more holistic understanding. Professor Browne begins by addressing two enduring questions. In his words, what is madness and what is psychotherapy? He takes us on a journey through the contributions of three great pioneers of psychotherapy, Freud, Adler and Jung. By re-evaluating their theories and methodologies, Professor Browne sheds light on what he finds valuable in their work, though he acknowledges that others might have different perspectives. The discussion also critiques the historical and ongoing approaches in medicine and psychiatry, particularly the misunderstandings around treating patients. Dr. Browne emphasizes that real change comes from within the individual, not through external interventions alone. He shares anecdotes from his own career and experiences, illustrating the evolution of therapeutic practices and the ongoing struggle against outdated medical models. Listeners today will gain a nuanced appreciation for the foundational concepts of psychotherapy, the complexities of human trauma, and the importance of supporting individuals on their journey to self-healing. Whether you're a student of psychology, a practicing clinician, or simply curious about the human mind, this episode promises to be a thought-provoking listen. Join us as we navigate the intricate and often misunderstood world of psychotherapy, guided by the wisdom and experience of the late and great Professor Ivor Browne.
So, there are two questions that have bugged me now for about 50 years. One is, what is madness? And I did a thing on that recently. And the other one was, what is psychotherapy? And I keep coming back to it. You're probably all clear what it is, but I'm not. So I thought for this, as a way of approaching it, to go back. Oh, you have any water? You always forget that because you get thirsty when you're talking. Still do, it doesn't matter. I thought if I could go back to the three great pioneers, Freud, Adler and Jung, that I might be able to sort of ask the question, what's valuable in the contribution of each of them? Now, what I think is valuable would probably be very different from what you would think is valuable. Each person would probably take their own. But anyway, it's just, as I say, what I felt looking at their careers. So that's what I was doing. But before I get to that, I looked up in the dictionary this question of therapy from the Greek root therapia. And it's interesting that one version of it is meaning to treat, which would be the main thing with medical doctors. The idea that we do something to somebody to change them, which I think is probably the deepest misunderstanding in the whole of medicine, because I don't think we can do anything to change anyone. I think people can change themselves, and you can be some support to them in doing that. So I found that so that's just to mention. All of that, I think, follows from this premise that you can do something to a person that's going to change them. And you can see, I think, how false it is. What actually happened, the reason insulin coma therapy appeared to be effective was that they were taking people in different parts of the world from big anonymous wards, all going around like zombies, and bringing them into a small group where they could develop some group relationship. And that was the therapeutic part of it. Until a fellow, I think he was in the mausoleum, one of the few decent things they've done there, he put people to sleep just with the barbiturate and showed that the result was exactly the same, a little better. It was completely bogus therapy. And it's funny, my old boss, I was telling Ian, where's Ian gone to? Oh, can you hear me over there? Okay, yeah. But Joshua Bearer, he was actually there at the time when, and I can't think of the name of the fellow who started that therapy, and he saw it was bogus back at that time, but nobody would listen to him. So that's how these things continue on a false premise, I think. So anyway, I was looking up, the other tragedy in a way is that because medicine is geared like that, and psychotherapy is derived from medicine, still to this day, possibly some of yourselves, think of the idea of giving psychotherapy, like 10 sessions of cognitive behavior therapy, which again is another lie. You don't give therapy to anyone. You support what they're going to hopefully do about it. And the only, as I understand it now, the only real work is when a person works on changing themselves. And if they're not prepared to get into that, you could be the greatest therapist in the world and you can't do a damn thing. How often do you ever hear that said? So I looked then at another definition, an alternative translation, to be of service, to attend to heal. And I think that's much more appropriate, not only to psychotherapy, but actually to the whole of medicine. Because if you take something like, I suppose an extreme interference, you can get like a heart-lung transplant. When all that is done, and the person has a new heart and lungs, they still have to take over their own health, or they're going to stay an invalid and die, and a lot actually do. So, in the end of all, even in medicine, it's our own healing power that is actually the center of things. Some interventions can help towards that. And it's interesting at the moment, while psychiatry is relentlessly refusing to change, they're still pursuing this idea, we want to be real doctors that will be accepted by the medical doctors. And of course they're only laughed at. And if they get a psychiatric unit in a general hospital, it's usually down the end of a corridor, and people do this when they see them. So they don't really get accepted. But that's what they're pursuing. Now, the medicine they want to be accepted by is 19th century medicine. And again, I hope I don't get too lost in this, but just as a slight digression, when I was in the public school of health in Harvard, I was lucky enough to find a book called the Milieu Intérieur, or in English translation, The Internal Milieu, by Claude Bernard. He was a contemporary of Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur did this great bit of work of demonstrating that bacteria actually existed and could cause disease. And he did it so well that it was accepted. But the whole of medicine then turned over to attacking bacteria. When in fact, the vast majority of bacteria are not only helpful, but actually essential to us being alive. So the whole emphasis, and that's what tends to happen, went off in that direction. Claude Bernard was interested in immunity. That's what he meant by the internal milieu, which Cannon afterwards called homeostasis. In other words, that we actually manage our health and ourselves. But he was obliterated. Now I see medicine is coming back to that. Most of the things happening at the moment are attempts to increase immunity, to move in on the natural healing, and to support it. Like even training viruses for cancer and so on. And I would predict that within 10 years, these awful treatments like chemotherapy for cancer will be gone completely, just like most of these other interferences. And we'll be moving back to strengthening and helping immunity, which is, again, supporting the person who's doing their work at the physical level in the same way that I think we'll be doing in psychotherapy. Am I making myself clear? So, but it's interesting to say that psychiatrists are wanting to be 19th century doctors attacking, and they've tried every kind of bacterial theory and malaria treatments, whereas I say medicine's moving quite rapidly, and the lay public out there are moving ahead again. There's more. If you read any woman's magazine, and women have been pivotal in this, it's all about maintaining your health. Jogging, all these peculiar things that people do. I couldn't run 100 yards, but anyway. So, the ordinary people are already moving in on this everywhere. The doctors are beginning to change, but the psychiatrists are holding out relentlessly, which I think is rather sad. So that brings me back to this idea of going back to look at Freud, Adler and Jung. One of the things that happened to me in going back over some of this, now I'm not pretending I didn't read the 20 volumes of Freud and another 20 of Jung. I've been reading bits and pieces for most of my career, But one of the things I found happening was getting more respect for Freud and a little bit less respect for Carl Jung, although I've a great admiration for the good things that he did. Have any of you read the group of letters between Freud and Jung when they were splitting? Because in that, it seems to me, Freud behaved in a very mature, fatherly sort of way, very kind, trying to compromise, and Jung behaved like a petulant, spoiled child, attacking him viciously. So, also in his later career, Jung seemed to be quite an anti-Semite. So there were sides like that, in spite of all the wonderful things that he did. So I found that change in looking at between Freud and Jung. Adler is much more left out. But I was fortunate. I was telling Ian, where's he gone to now? He's disappeared again.
Turn it down the heat.
That I worked with Joshua Beer in 1959 for a year, and that turned my whole career around. And he was a pupil of Adler, so I got a direct connection back to that time, 1911. Sorry? Did someone say something?
Very impressive.
What?
Very impressive, Ivor.
So Adler was the first rebel to leave Freud, and then Jung followed on after that. So I was asking the question, the first great tribute I have to pay to Freud is that he really came up with the whole idea of psychotherapy. And it's a bit like Darwin. The world changed after Freud. It was just a different consciousness. I often think my own father was pre-Freudian. He had no concept that there was such a thing as the unconscious. So he would unconsciously mete out all his criticisms of me as part of propping up his own ego, but no idea that he was doing that, So I was thinking I can think of 3 areas that seem to me were great contributions of Freud, even though a lot of the theories he had don't stand up. And in fact, particularly in the States, they've thrown the whole baby out of the bathwater. He's just denigrated, which is, to my mind, very wrong. First thing about Freud was that he was, as against, say, Adler, he was much more of an introvert, and he wasn't that interested in being a clinician. He really wanted to find the truth of things. So, does everyone can see there all right, yeah? So, he had a veritable passion to understand, as Ernest Jones in his biography said. And as I say, he was the first. And this changed. The whole of consciousness sort of deepened, just as it did with Darwin, although I think Darwin, again, has got too much credit because Lamarck was the real founder of evolution. But that's for another topic. So, first of all, philosophers and sages had been hinting at the idea that there are levels of consciousness for hundreds of years, but it takes somebody to write, sort of bring this out into the daylight, and that's what Freud did. So, yeah, I've said all that. We'll move on. So it seemed to me the first major contribution he made was that he recognized the significance of trauma. Now, he wasn't the first, because Joseph Breuer, and even before that, Charcot, the neurologist in France, had looked at this. But nevertheless, Freud, when he was only 4 or 5 months over with Charcot, but it influenced him greatly, and he got this idea about trauma. But when he came back, Joseph Breuer, who was much older, teamed up with him, and he had a very clear idea about trauma. So between the two of them, they not only brought out the fact that when we've been traumatized, it can have a long-term effect. And I don't know if you've read those early papers from that time, but of course the title for illness at that time of what we now call neurosis was hysteria. But they said, and this is what interests me so much, hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences found to be astonishingly intact, to possess a remarkable sensory force, and when they returned, they acted with all the effective strength of new experience. That's exactly what I found. It was one of the things that, as I say, changed my whole direction, because when I went to Joshua Beer in 1959, he had set up the first proper day hospital in the world. He'd also created a genuine therapeutic community, and his aim in life was to get rid of mental hospitals. So he had an enormous influence on me personally. But the other thing that happened during that year was that Sandoz, who had, I think it was Hoffman, had synthesized LSD, and they thought it looked like a model psychosis, so they were sending samples around, and one of the places got a sample. Stan Groff, that I'm sure you know of, also got samples of that, and that sent him in his direction. So we were giving LSD to people. Now, none of us had a clue, and I certainly didn't have a clue as to where it could be applicable, but you saw very strange experiences happen. You saw people reacting exactly that way, coming up with, not with memories, and I find this is still misunderstood to this day, actually moving into an experience. I call it the frozen present, because when it comes as an experience happening now. Just one example, I remember when we were working in the old, what had been the Protestant church in Grange Gorman, and we'd have 13 or 14 people going through hell, and one woman who'd lost her mother about 10 years before sat up in the middle of the therapy and wanted to go out and arrange the funeral. That's not like ordinary memory. She was actually experiencing her mother as having just died. Sorry?
Reliving.
No, not reliving, living. That's one of the funny, the use of language. And I was just reading another book called The Haunted Self by two or three Dutch therapists, and they're still using this term, reliving, re-experiencing. If you've experienced something, you don't have to experience it again. It's experiencing these things for the first time because they've been frozen. We'll come back to that later. So I was amazed when I saw people. I remember one particular fellow, he was a gay Irish fellow, and as soon as you gave him about 50 micrograms of LSD, he was very camp, very militant about being gay and so on. Within an hour, he was back at 3 or 4 years of age, weeping and crying for his father, and he was in a totally different experience. Now, I don't remember getting anywhere. When he came out, he went back to his former thing. But nowadays, I would have been able to move something there. So I was amazed at how these quotes fitted so well with what I was seeing. The other thing, great point that Freud made at that time was the last sentence: recollection without affect almost invariably produces no result. In other words, this is, a lot of people have an intellectual memory, say, of their brother or parent or whoever having died, when they move into the experience of the death that they haven't yet experienced, it's a completely different thing. And when they hit that feeling, that's when you see change. So it's a very crucial point, and Freud pinpointed this. So it seemed to me that he made an amazing breakthrough. Unfortunately, he moved on, and he began to see the influence of sexual trauma, sexual abuse and so on, seduction, and they called it the seduction theory. I know you know all this. But the trouble was that he hoisted himself on his own petard, as they say. He focused everything over that. Breuer gave up at that point because he didn't like this idea. And I think he got a bit frightened. And he also saw the kind of social dangers it could land you in. But Freud moved right across to everything was sexual trauma. And that's when he wrote his paper, Etiology of Hysteria. Unfortunately, he's pinpointed, and he was right, of course, about sexual traumas. In fact, far more common than he realized even. But it's not the whole of trauma. It's just one form of trauma. So, but that got him into considerable difficulty. And this is where the question came from me. I was seeing these things. I was reading those early papers, and then reading his paper, Etiology of Hysteria. But then, and I brought the book with me just so I could find a few of the quotes. One of the points he made at that time was the fact that these patients never repeat these stories spontaneously, nor do they ever, in the course of treatment, suddenly present the physician, with the complete recollection of scenes of this kind. One only succeeds in awakening the psychical trace of a precocious sexual event under the most energetic pressure of the analytic procedure and against enormous resistance. Now that's what I found over and over again in hundreds of people, that when there's frozen experience, they built up around it an enormous resistance. If it's very early, it's the resistance of most of their life. And they'll do anything but look at what that's about. And people will often in the middle of a session say, I'd face anything but this. If they go on, and if you can encourage them and they go on through, they say, why didn't I do this years ago? You know, it can be as marked as that. So Freud was saying that at that time. But what I couldn't understand, when you move on to, I always get the dates wrong now. This is, 20th century, it's 1897. We're still in the 19th century. And I got this quote from Ernest Jones's biography. You're probably familiar with it, but I'll read it out anyway. Up to the spring of 1897, Freud still held firmly to his conviction of the reality of child traumas. So strong was Charcot's teaching on traumatic experience, and so surely did the analysis of the patient's associations reproduce them. At that time, doubts began to creep in, although he made no mention of them in the records of progress that he was regularly sending to his friend Fliess. Fliess was this surgeon in Berlin, which you may be familiar. Do you know all this already? Is it of interest or what? Anyway, but then quite suddenly, he decided to confide in Fliess the great secret of something which in the past few months has gradually dawned on me. It was the awful truth that most, and he never was happy with it for the rest of his life, not all, of the seductions in childhood which his patients had revealed and on which he had built his whole theory of hysteria never occurred. The letter of the 21st of September 1897, in which he made this announcement to Fliess, is the most valuable of that valuable series, which was so fortunately preserved. But what got me was there was no explanation. Why did he change his mind? And because he didn't say why, he just said that this was what he found. And I had to wait from 1959 until, I think it was 1984, that Masson wrote, have you read Assault on Truth? it's well worth reading. So there's Ian is back. You'll have to keep an eye on me. We're okay for the moment. But I have to say a bit about this. Masson was the son of a Sanskrit scholar, and he was a Sanskrit scholar himself, a young man. But being Jewish, of course, and analysis of kind of a Jewish religion, he went into psychoanalysis. And some of the head cats like Anna Freud and Eisler in New York spotted him and said, this is exactly what we need. We need someone to work on the Freud archive in Hampstead. And here's a man who's a genuine scholar. So they didn't actually confirm his appointment, but they started him. And he then found a whole group of letters that hadn't been published to Fleece. And this blew my mind when I read it. It was first in the New York Times. And so finally it actually began to answer this question, because there were a couple of things that happened. Fleece was a nutcase who actually was abusing his own son, but he had this notion that the nose was an alternative sexual organ, and if you operate on the nose and remove turbinate bones or something, that you could cure hysteria. So Freud formed these very almost homosexual relationships at different points, like he had with Jung later. But anyway, he thought this was great, and he had this patient. Are you familiar with the story of Emma Eckstein? You all know it? No? Everybody? Anyway, we'll just mention it briefly. She became a very famous psychoanalyst afterwards, but she was showing a lot of the symptoms of hysteria, cutting herself and all these, the typical things we think of in post-traumatic stress. And Freud invited Fleece to come, and he operated on her nose, and then he went back to Berlin. But the operation wasn't a success. She started infected, and her nose started to suppurate. And Freud had to call in another surgeon. And when the other surgeon came, he cleaned up things and cut something and pulled out about a yard of gauze that Fleece had left in her nose. So he'd not only done a crazy operation, but he'd botched it. The minute that came out, she bled a flood of blood and lost consciousness, and they thought she was dying. Freud got such a fright he had to get a glass of brandy out in the next office, but she did recover then slowly. But this was part of the change. First of all, he delivered this etiology of hysteria to the Neurological and Psychiatric Society in Vienna, saying that his patients were all being sexually abused, who were the friends or colleagues or sons or daughters of the very people he was talking to, because he was in private practice. So it said it sank like a lead balloon. He was saying it was the end, it was the great breakthrough, like the source of the Nile. So that happened, and almost around the same time he had this debacle with Emma Eckstein, who kept bleeding periodically. And then he writes to Fleece. This is the letters that Masson uncovered. Where is that? Anyway, he said that a lecture on the etiology of hysteria, Psychiatry Society, received an icy reception from the asses and from Krafft Ebing, who wrote a lot about sexual pathologies. The strange common. It sounds like a scientific fairy tale. After this, after one had demonstrated to them the source of the Nile, they had great trouble finding the source of the Nile. In a further letter to Fleece on May the 4th, Freud wrote, "I am as isolated as you could wish me to be. The word has been given out to abandon me, and a void is forming around me." So several things were happening. First of all, his psychoanalysis wasn't working very well. I can't remember where I read it, but somebody said that Freud was a great therapist when he wasn't practicing psychoanalysis. He always failed when he was. And I think generally psychoanalysis is not a very satisfactory method of therapy. It's very weak, the idea of free association. So he was being very isolated. His practice wasn't working. He wasn't getting referrals. And then he had Emma Eckstein bleeding to death. And then he comes through with this remarkable about-face. In 16th of April, he delivered the paper in April 1896. And in 16th of April 1896, Freud writes to Fliess, he had found a completely surprising explanation of Eckstein's hemorrhages, which will give you much pleasure. I have already figured out the story. I should be able to prove to you that you were right, that her episodes of bleeding were hysterical. This is a woman who almost died from a major hemorrhage. Were occasioned by longing and probably occurred at the sexually relevant times. This was another crazy theory that Fliess had about numbers and periods. On May the 4th, he explained further, so far I know that she bled out of longing. She had always been a bleeder when cutting herself in similar circumstances. When she saw how affected I was by her first hemorrhage, she experienced this as the realization of an old wish to be loved in her illness. So he turned, and this was Freud's amazing ability, he could turn the whole thing upside down, go off on a new theory. So his main concern during all that period was for Fliess's reputation. He was saying, he made the mistake, he shouldn't have exposed Fliess in this way. And now he's saying that, in fact, her bleeding wasn't due to the botched operation. It was her longing for him to come to see her. So those few things combined seem to turn around and at last give some explanation why he's saying that he didn't any longer believe this reality of sexual abuse. But the tragedy of that is that in 1914, and much later, he wrote, when this ideology broke down under the weight of its own improbability and contradiction in definitely ascertainable circumstances, the result at first was helpless bewilderment. Analysis had led back to these infantile sexual traumas by the right path, and yet they were not true. The firm ground of reality was gone. At that time, I would gladly have given up the whole work, just as my esteemed predecessor Breuer had done when he made his unwelcome discovery. I think when they got the first case of sexual, Breuer got frightened. Perhaps I persevered only because I no longer had any choice and could not then take on anything else. But here what he says is that if hysterical subjects trace back their symptoms to traumas that are fictitious, then the new fact which emerges is precisely that they create such scenes in fantasy. And this psychical reality requires to be taken into account alongside practical reality. This reflection was soon followed by the discovery that these fantasies were intended to cover up the autoerotic activity in the first years of childhood. And he says that's when the whole range of a child's sexual life came to light. So he reversed the whole thing, and where he had said that if an adolescent got nervous when being sexually approached, it was because they'd been abused earlier. Now he was saying that if they got nervous in adolescence, it was because they had been sexual as in the first years, the whole notion of the Oedipus complex. And so the whole development of psychoanalysis came out of that then. But the tragedy of it, as I see it, is that he obscured the difference between reality and fantasy. And that has, for 100 years, really has dogged certainly psychiatry and a lot of psychotherapy. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. Yeah. I think it matters a hell of a lot whether it's true. And not only that, but we know now how much sexual abuse there's been of all kinds, clerical and otherwise, far more, as I say, than Freud could conceive, and the terrible reality of it, and it's still going on. And yet, in effect, psychotherapy for 100 years became incapable of dealing with it because it didn't matter, and all you were interested in was little girls flirting with their daddies in the Oedipus complex, which happens, but it's nothing particularly abnormal, in ordinary circumstances. So that's enough about that. I think I'll have to press on now fairly quickly. I'm deliberating too much. So I'm saying that the two tragic errors. One was the truth that that this was just fantasy, and well, I've said all that. Yeah, it was blurred the confusion to this day, and I have already read that out to you. So I think the second great contribution seems to me that Freud made was that he hung in with the nastier side of life. He never left the family and the conflicts, whereas Carl Jung and Adler, both, and a lot of people since, wanted to kind of, let's get beyond that nasty bit, like a Salioli, and get on to the nice spiritual activities and peak experiences and all this. But the fact is that we do have to deal with this rather nasty side of life and all the terrible things that do actually happen in families. In case I forget to say that somebody said I was last night commenting on this film, Patrick's Day. I would really love everyone here to see it. It's a brilliant film, and it brings out so clearly the sort of things that can happen between a mother and son, or between father and mother, which is actually in it there too. I don't know if you know the 3 or 4 proofs that Jesus Christ was really Irish, do you? No? Well, first of all, he was 30. He was hanging around with the boys. He wasn't Irish. He was worried they'd run out of drink. And he thought his mother was a virgin, and she thought he was God. He had to be Irish. But I mean, it's a stereotype, but it's also sadly very true, because boys brought up like that become very inadequate husbands, so mothers then focus on their male offspring, or one of them, and of course they turn out to be inadequate husbands in turn, and the whole thing of the virgin mother and the God son develops. And it it's a joke, but it also has rather sad implications. It really is in there and behind this, the whole thing of that film. So you must see it. It's going on general circuit now. Patrick's Day. Has anyone seen it yet? No? What?
Clips, I saw short clips of it.
You saw it? Yeah.
Not the whole thing, little clips on the
Oh, yeah. No, it's worth seeing the whole film. In fact, because even I saw it again last night. I hadn't even picked up that you could see she comes at one point, the mother, how dissatisfied and how hurt she was. The husband just opted out. So it was really, and then she focused totally on enveloping the son. And it was about love. But love can turn upside down and become a distortion and become very dangerous. It's like caring can be a very dangerous thing. So that was, I think, as I say, the second point of Freud. He stuck to that seamy side of life and worked away at it in his different ways, even though a lot of what he did was wrong. But the trouble with that, it seems to me, that because of his messianic aspirations, that he wants to find the ultimate truth, and things like the Oedipus complex therefore has to apply to everyone. So how do you make any distinction then between where it's not very pleasant, like sexual abuse, and where it's just a factor of a child loving her mother or father, So I think that was because he had to find universal principles. That was what he was searching for. But it really wasn't helpful when it came to therapy. So that was the second aspect, and I think the way, again, that it didn't work out as it might have. I think the third great contribution, to my mind, is the defense mechanisms. I don't think we need to spend time on that, but I mean, we all have these to a greater or less extent. And this area of the frozen present, of course, is an extreme example of defense. So that not only you don't know what you're afraid of what happened, but you know both intimately and sensitively what to avoid. So say if a woman is raped in a lift, she'll avoid going into a lift, but she may not know that she was ever raped in that way. So those are the three contributions I felt that endure in what Freud did and are still valuable. Now, coming on to Adler, this is much less known. Trouble is to keep this open. But first of all, Adler was the first rebel. He became unhappy with Freud's emphasis on sexuality and libido, as Jung did afterwards. And Adler had been a sickly child, so he had made a major thing about overcoming deficits. And a lot of people know that about him, compensation for weakness. But that's by no means the important things of what he did. The main difference between him and Freud was he was a very strong extrovert, whereas Freud was a very much introverted and searching for truth. Adler was a real doctor who wanted to help people. But I can go fairly quickly through. First of all, he related to others as human beings, and that's what I learned from old Joshua Beerer, who had been his pupil. He used to say that Joshua was more Beerian than Adlerian, but because he had his own way of thinking of things. But Adler started there for the first child guidance clinics, and he would have whole families in and other community members. People later did that, but he was the first. But he gets no recognition for doing any of this. He was the first to really work with the psychotic young person as a human being. Again, written out of history. So, the other thing is this great German word, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which is hard to translate into English, but something like a sense of community, of relationship. And so he had a very strong social influence, and that's why he would have different groups of people in. He gradually moved more and more into education and education of children and so on. But that was a very central thing, probably the most important contribution he was making. And of course, that's come back since with community psychiatry, such as it is, and the whole notion of social psychiatry. But the interesting thing, as I say, is that I've said that first child guidance clinics dealt with whole families, teachers and others. And often it's described in the literature that when he would focus on one child in the family, others who were just there listening would get the message and they'd make major change. Now you could say it brings up questions about confidentiality and so on, but he did open things out, and in the process got rid of a lot of secrets and dishonesty that goes on in families. And he really was the originator of family therapy also. But again, no credit to him for it. And if you like, he was also the pioneer in terms of preventive psychiatry, because he felt if you went back and worked with children, then although it's a chicken and egg thing, because when you work with children, you find you're working with the adult parents again. So he's been said to be the father, therefore, of ego psychology, and a lot of and he was much more hands-on that way. He was less interested in the past, and that's, I think, Freud's strength. But he would be very much doing the sort of things that people are now talking about under the heading of cognitive behavioral therapy, changing your way of handling your life in the present, So, the other thing then he saw, as I said, minimum interest really in the past, other than overcoming weaknesses. And that aspect, so he felt you had to try and find the goal, or help the person to find the goal of the direction that could make sense of their life. And of course that's a very important thing. I'll say a bit more about that later. So those are the main things to do with Adler. But I think the deficit was that he didn't have any much insight into trauma, and that's where I found Joshua had departed from him, and he paid great attention to the sort of thing that Freud had been started, and the whole notion that trauma can have long-term effects. So this is the interesting thing to say, that nearly all of those things that Adler started, Freudians later, people like Erich Fromm, Salioli with the psychosynthesis, Maslow, all of these brought in these changes later, but not one of them ever mentioned Adler, which is the interesting thing, I think. And I would never have heard him if I hadn't got to Joshua, and also then got to America from that, and got hold of the notion of immunity and so on. So that's all I have to say. Is there anything that you feel I've left out about Adler? But you can see...
Adler gets a bit of credit in America.
What?
Adler gets a bit of credit in America. Adlerian psychology gets a bit of credit in America. I mean,
yeah, there's a small group of Adlerians, but they're still kind of shut off. I remember I went to an Adlerian course when I was with Joshua, and there was a little old fellow with big boots, I can remember him, and he took me scrupulous notes of everything and he'd obviously heard it year after year, but it was completely locked off. It was not connected to anything else. So now I'm moving on to Carl Jung. So Adler left Freud in 1911, sorry. Get the dates wrong all the time. Jung didn't pay any attention much to that. He was still working actively, and he'd been made sort of the central person in psychoanalysis. And Freud saw him as the person who could really take over psychoanalysis. Freud was very aware that being a kind of Jewish system, that unless he could get out of that and get some Gentile to open it up more, it would never spread. It would remain a kind of Jewish ghetto. So he was very conscious of that, and he thought Jung was going to be his son and really opened the whole thing out. And that's where Carl Jung didn't like that picture. But as I say, when Adler was saying the same kind of things, he didn't pay any attention. He was at the time actually writing this book he wrote. First thing, he was already becoming very unhappy about Freud's sexual idea of libido. He felt it, and I think he's right that another aspect libido would say is sort of life energy in a much more general sense. So he was writing this book, Transformations and Symbols of Libido. It was published in 1911. At the very time that Adler was going through his rebellion, and Freud was very angry, and it was a pretty nasty period. So he was already departing from Freud, but he didn't. It only came out then later, finally in 1912. And this was a bitter disappointment to Freud. And then I thought, again, a bit like his petulant letters to Freud, I'm in no way exclusively stemmed from Freud. I had my scientific attitude on the theory of complexes before I met Freud, which is accurate. The teachers that influenced me above all were Eugene Bleuler, the older one, who coined the term schizophrenia, and Pierre Janet, who also made a major contribution, and he was the closest to what I've been trying to understand under the term frozen present. And in fact, in this book, I wrote a paper called Unassimilated Happenings. That's a direct quote from a section of one of Janet's books. So whether we'll get on to that or not, I don't know. So I thought he was, I don't know much who are the great hypnotists here, because Theodore Flornay was one of the great, you're a major hypnotist. Do you know about Fleur? I don't know much about him, but there were a number of French, like Bernheim, there were a number of people working at hypnosis at that time. So, I think Jung then made an extraordinary number, really, of important contributions when you think of it. Always in a very generalized sense. He'd hint at things, but he wouldn't sort of try to really pin them down. So, his association test, did you see that? What was the film called? A Dangerous something? Dangerous Mind. Yeah, he was doing the association test with that woman as well as screwing her.
Yeah,
and he was a devil, because he used to be screwing some patient while his wife was actually cooking the dinner, which was something of a departure from proper ethics. But anyway, he also, and I think this was very important, talked about different types of personality. He had 4 major types. The ones that, in a simplified way, I would think to me most useful is the notion of introversion, extroversion, because this is one of the big difficulties with psychiatry. As soon as you mention any kind of characteristic, like being rather introverted, it's immediately pathologized over to become Asperger's syndrome. Now they've done away with Asperger's syndrome to the consternation of the Asperger Society. But this only just shows the nonsense that goes on. But in fact, Jung really made this distinction. There's no implication of something wrong in saying someone's introvert or extrovert. You can have an equally good life trajectory if you work it well. So some of the great comedians are typically extroverted. Particularly great Jewish comedians are people like Billy Connolly and Spike Milligan. And they have a very cyclothymic, easily changing mood. And when they're high, of course, they have all these associations that they make them very funny. So they can do very well along that dimension. But that's a tragic failure, I think, to not separate basic type of personality from the pathological aspects of it when things go wrong. And because of that, that's one of the reasons I think psychiatrists invented all these mythical illnesses like schizophrenia and this awful thing of bipolar. Even in the psychiatric literature, what was called manic depression was considered, and it was quite rare. And generally, if you waited long, it had a fairly good outcome. Now, every second person that comes to me is bipolar, and it's very clearly created by the drugs. And I was wondering, how did it kind of catch on? I found then a fellow called Bieberman in the States made this his vocation. He's since, I don't know if he's in jail, but he certainly was brought to book because he was taking money from pharmaceutical companies and everything. But he let the cat out of the bag, and now everyone is being diagnosed with bipolar, clearly produced by the antidepressants, mainly, in what they call rapid cycling. So, the other thing he did was these, and I'm sure you've all read those, I think there are 3 essays on synchronicity. I mean, that was, again, a sort of quick insight, but not developing it that much further. But still something that's coming back all the time and is being developed, the notion that not only do things connect, and if you go to the quantum area, that everything is interconnected below the surface, but that the outside environment matches your inner experience. This is what Jung pinpointed. And that's, I think, being recognized slowly, more and more. So that was another major contribution. And then he also made the connection then to what the quantum physics were already coming up with about the interconnectedness of everything. I don't know if you've read this book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. David Bohm, who was actually a student of Einstein, it's a beautiful book, and he makes this point that above a line in the kind of practical world, everything's disconnected. We're all separate cells, and of course, medicine even exemplifies that all the more by not connecting anything. But below the level, once you move down to subatomic realities, it turns into patterns, and everything is interconnected. And of course, that's beginning to appear at the macroscopic level now, that we're also interconnected much more than we thought. So Jung pointed to that too. He, a bit like Adler, started to look to the future, but he also did look to the past. And he had worked quite intensively with traumatic situations, like that woman in the film, I can't think of her name. But he did still see the future, the goal, as more important. So he was moving across, and the same thing as Adler said, you've got to try and help the person to find the direction that can make sense of their lives. I often think, a good friend of mine, Sebastian Barry, as a joke I call him Mr. Ashburger, he if he hadn't found the channel of writing, I think he could well be what we call a schizophrenic, because he naturally goes into his inner world. But he's found a channel, and now he can give a wonderful talk, and and he can has a family, and everything is, he's developed a whole social side. So it's just an example, I think, what can happen if you can find the direction. And then I had a passage here that I wanted to come to. That's okay. Yeah. Well, I have those little yolks. The trouble is you can never find what you want. This paragraph, I think it may be in the big... How many of you got that big red book? Yeah, I've never read the whole of it, but I read parts of it, and I read the introduction, which is very lengthy. But he said a more or less superficial layer of the unconscious, undoubtedly personal, he would have shared somewhere with Freud. I call it the personal unconscious, but this personal unconscious rests upon a deeper layer which does not derive from personal experience and is not a personal acquisition, but is inborn. This deeper layer I call the collective unconscious, and then he developed the whole archetype idea. And of course that fits then with, now I've lost your little yoke.
I don't worry
It makes a connection then with the wisdom of the East, both in China and India, because these rishis going back to 10,000 years, we're seeing this connection that this deeper unconscious merges out, where the true self is not an ego self, but is actually merges with the universal. So Freud, or Jung again, was pointing at this in the way that he did. And a lot of work has been done then. You find a child in New York in primary school drawing the Ouroboros, the snake with the tail in its mouth, and all that kind of stuff. I'll have to watch. Are we already getting out of time? So I'll have to press on. But there's a paragraph here I did want to read out from the Red Book, where he said, the period, first of all, he went down into, that's when he did the year, at the very time he was breaking from Freud. It wasn't really much to do with Freud. He was always fascinated by mythology and so on. He went down into his unconscious, and he went through ferocious things of seeing all kinds of demons and all. But one of the things in the Red Book that he says that he was horrified by visions and dreams of mass destruction. And he said himself, he thought he was going schizophrenic, he was going psychotic. And then when the war started in 1914, he got a great sense of relief. He realized this is what he was actually seeing ahead of time, was this awful destruction of the Great War. And he felt very relieved. But he said, the period of which I have spoken to you, when I pursued the inner images, were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. So he said in effect that all he did after that was sort of extrapolating. As very often happens, youngish people hit their creative period and then they spend the rest of their life sort of working it out. But at my age, you don't get many creative ideas. So he was quite clear that there were two forms of thinking, and at first he had no time for this. That's one of the pictures in the Red Book of these images that came to him. He wanted to be a scientist, and he said he didn't like this thing of fantasy thinking. Then he went down to his unconscious, and then he realized that there were two things, verbal and logical science, which he still held on to one development, and then passive associative, imagistic mythology. So that was where he connected so many things together. That's another of the pictures from the Red Book. And he drew these, and even the writing in German, not that I can read the German, is very beautiful. And that's the quote I was reading out to you there. Okay. So, the ancient rishis are saying he connected with them, and also Jewish, Christian, and Sufi mystics. So he was very interested in the whole of spirituality, in effect. And I think he would have been clear enough about the difference between religion and spirituality, which I think is fundamental. Did you see this thing of, what's the name of the fellow with Gay Byrne?
Stephen Fry.
What?
Stephen Fry.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to me an extraordinary failure of atheists to understand what they're saying.
Well, the objective personality God is man, or has the personality of man instead of God being just an ism.
Yeah. Yeah, but also, to answer his criticism of God, you would have to do away with any idea of free will. In other words, that we have a part. When you actually look at evolution, it's been a partnership, not just as humans or even as animals, but right back into atomic things. From the beginning, whatever started creation, we've been part of it, developing it, actively working at it. And he's missing that completely. So in other words, for his version of God to work, you would have to actually we'd have to be a crowd of passive robots, completely incapable of yeah. And he just completely misses that. Hmm? Yeah, well, I think that's the failure in sort of thinking through. The paper in this I called, not sure what I called it now. You might be interested just to look at it. Love and respect for freedom, I called it. Because if you think about it, the only way we can actually use our freedom is if we do the will of God. If we do anything else, we get into trouble. You know, I should be free to go and screw any woman or man as I like, but you get a sexual addiction. I should be free to take any drugs, and I should be free to drink. All of those things lead into slavery. The only thing that can actually work is to use our potential for freedom to do what makes sense, which is, I don't like the term God, but so those are again pictures from the big book. So since then, since young, you've had Otto Rank, Viktor Frankl, Abraham Maslow, Martin Buber, Erich Fromm, Roberto Assalioli, Carl Rogers, all making this central point of moving on. And it seems to me that I've only 5 minutes left now. Actually, I'm only halfway through. It does seem to me that there are two halves to therapy. The first half, you know, where there's a lot of trauma and so on, or just whatever form of family influences, where you have to go down into the nasty things. And then the second half is moving in the opposite direction and closing the thing down and finding the direction for the person. So they're two, in a way, quite discrete halves. But if you try to jump over to the nice part without doing the nasty work, it doesn't work. Equally, if you just get stuck with the nastiness, again, the person is stuck. I have one fellow at the moment now who's just been doing all this in regression activity. He's so opened up, he's in a totally dependent position, with about 10 people trying to help him, and none of them can do anything because he's not doing anything himself. So, quick word about my old boss. Don't need to say much except to say he turned the whole direction of my life. Joshua's dream was to get rid of mental hospitals, and he was very much an Adler pupil. He was very intensely sociable. When he came over, he escaped out of Nazi Germany, and he was even interviewed by Adolf Eichmann, I was telling you, and he managed to escape out of that. But when he went over, he had no English, and yet the little woman who had German, who was in the day hospital, said that he would sit down with a young schizophrenic and he'd break through to them in an hour. And I saw him do this. I remember one day I was over in his office because I had a year of kind of psychoanalysis with him. And this young girl brought in who was completely mute, hadn't spoken to anyone. In an hour he had her chatting. And I saw him do this over and over again by just moving in to the heart and into the relationship. So he was a great old character, but also a bit of a psychopath. He had a number of wives and so on. But anyway, so that's par for the course. But he did combine, like he realized the importance really of trauma and all that side of things, and working with the LSD at the time, as well as seeing the social side that Adler was developing. So that was mainly the way he was looking at things. And the year I was there, we saw over 1,000 people, and only 20 had to go into mental hospital, and they were all at the weekend, because there was no, later he opened at the weekend. So it was really quite remarkable. And a lot of that work has been done by others since. And again, his strength all the time was that you're dealing, and that's all I try to do now, is to relate to people as human beings. I don't relate to patients or clients, or even worse, service users. That's the most awful phrase that was ever developed. Completely depersonalized. He didn't know about systems theory, where we've had 50 years now of developing alternative science, but he was sensing it was there. And he had a lot to say about transference and counter-transference. He felt, if you just worked with the one person, that you could get into quite a hole. Whereas if you open the thing out and work in terms of getting the person to move into their own experience, then you don't have so much problems with transference. But now that Ian is looking at me, I can't go into that in much detail. And he was insistent on the whole thing of a person realizing and doing the work. And those are the things I learned that have just been the rest of my life. I wasted too much. And I was saying there, he was able to break through the glass wall. So I saw all of these things happening, and it was a great experience. This is one of the things he said: I believe there's no cure without change, there's no change without incentive, there's no incentive without meaning. The new meaning of life has to be experienced, and there's no experience unless patients are helped into a position where they can do things for themselves and carry the responsibility for their own mistakes. That really hits the center as far as I'm concerned. So I don't need to really say that much more. That's just a summary slide of trying to say what I felt were the main contributions of the three boys. And if we could now, as some people are beginning to use all of those insights, I think then we'd be somewhere nearer to finding out what psychotherapy is. And then, of course, you have this quite separate development from Pavlov in Russia. I remember meeting him when I was in the Mass General in Boston, a fellow saying, there's no mind, there's no brain even, there's just conditioned reflexes. He was shouting at me. Such an utter gobshite. So Pavlov pinned down, there's no about the reality of reflexes, and you can have. Pavlov's wife said he had the house full of slavering dogs, dripping saliva. But it moved on then to behavior therapy. People like Skinner, Ballpain. There was a great tradition in America of behavior therapy, but again, very narrow sort of. So, too limited. Then we move on with Aaron Beck to accepting that there is some kind of a mind in there, or a brain, and therefore you need to address that. And then you get on to cognitive behavior therapy. We try to change attitudes. Now they're talking about third stage CBT. And now the dialectical behavior therapy, which is, again, moving a bit closer to psychotherapy, and then cognitive analytic therapy. So if they could only move on and actually start practicing psychotherapy to solve things in that, which would include the cognitive and the behavioral aspect. It's a valid dimension of. So that's again just a summary. Am I okay to go on for a little while, Ian? Are you all bored still? No. Just trying to look at what does the therapist do? Well, the person seeks help. They have to appear. They have to undertake the work of pain, and they have to suffer the pain. And my several spiritual masters have made this point that we only grow actually when we suffer. and when we accept it, we don't grow. If I'd be hopefully watching the match this afternoon, I'm not going to grow by watching that. But it's a nice experience. When you get a nice experience, you can enjoy it. But you grow when you have to suffer and accept it. If you don't accept it, you just have more suffering and it doesn't achieve anything. So the acceptance is crucial. So, and I mean, any real change involves suffering. Even if you decide, look at this, to try and learn a language, it's painful. Whatever new thing you try to take up, I've been trying to learn Irish at the moment at 86. And it's just painful, you know. So the therapist, therefore, is primarily a guide, and you have to establish trust. And the change for me has been coming more and more of relating heart to heart rather than to brain. It seems to me that the West is intoxicated with brain activity. And in fact, even science is starting to show now that the heart is our real center, and there are more messages going from the heart to the brain, and the two work together than the brain to the heart. There's something like 40,000 neurons in the heart. It has its own mini brain. It's also more gentle but more powerful than the brain. If you want to measure the brain, you have to put electrodes right on here. If you want to measure the heart, you can actually measure it outside the body altogether. Or, you know, when you do a cardiograph. So, and therefore, the more you can move, it seems to me, in that direction, the more therapy seems to happen automatically. You find that you're less involved and the person is very clearly doing the work, but they can't do it on their own. And that seems to me to be central to therapy, because they're so full of defenses and resistances. And therefore, a big job of the therapist, I think, is to create an aura of safety. I think I should mention, actually, have you heard of Brian Weiss? Yeah, he's coming on the 28th of May at last. I was writing to him and asking him, and he couldn't get any good of him. Now he says he's definitely coming. And he'd probably do a big workshop. But using some of his sort of methods, I've one particular woman, and I often use the light like he does coming down right through the body, and she felt it was a yellow light, and she's able to go into a pretty awful abuse because she feels quite safe within that yellow light. So simple things like that. It's not rocket science, but it's essential. And he has this nice thing of a person going through a beautiful garden, you know, so you're building a protective surround. And it's incidental, where was I reading that? It's interesting that if you bring the light outside, then it's like a cocoon. And what the animal workers have found, if you, the cocoon of a caterpillar, and the caterpillar has to burst out of it with a lot of work. If you open it up artificially, the butterfly will never fly. He'll only fly if he does the work, which again is a manifestation of what Lamarck talked about as a thing from Darwin. These are all things that we could discuss for another few hours. So that's another point, it seems to me. I'm saying about the past. In fact, when you're working with trauma, you're never working with the past, you're working with what's there now. Even if what's there now is from a past life, it's still what's in the person now. Because we get into the past so much, we're inclined to think we're dealing with the past, but whatever happened has happened. It's what's been frozen or half stored and hasn't got properly into memory. That's what we have to work with. And that involves the person then going through the pain of experiencing it. So that seems to me the way it works. I don't need to spend time, and that's just saying the sort of work and why free association is far too weak. If you can get a person to free associate till they're blue in the face, and they won't go near an area that's painful. So it just doesn't work. I remember Beer had a funny story. There was great cafe life in Vienna before the Nazis moved in, and this analyst was working with the fellow, but he was pretty bored and he felt he'd like a cup of coffee, so he turned on his tape recorder and went off for a cup of coffee. 10 minutes later, the fellow himself, the patient, whatever you want to call him, came into the cafe. He said, "You're supposed to be going through your analysis." No, I turned on my tape recorder to talk to your tape recorder. So that's what I was saying a bit about there, about the heart being really central and the strongest influence. And this old man that had the most influence on my life, other than Joshua, his nickname was Babaji. Not Babaji. There are a lot of Babajis. His name was derived from because he was a simple court clerk. But he said the heart is the seat of the soul. It's not enough to love. One must become love. And I think that is, in a way, gives an insight, whatever God may be, that it's a centre of love. Certainly not a person. There's a thing in the Irish Times this morning about all the people's views of God, and they're all kind of personal fellas with beards like Santa Claus and so on. It's whatever that source is pure love, but it's also active. So it's coming into this planet all the time. But if our hearts are closed, we can't pick it up. It's like not having the right... at the moment there are probably several million messages going through this room. If you have the right iPhone, you can pick one up. And in the same way, I think our hearts can pick up the energy, the most subtle energy, if our heart opens. And that's the only purpose of meditation. Now, so I was saying that just about myself, like trying to reach more openness and get more into love. And you find then, as I say, people move and do the work somehow more easily without even necessarily having to use techniques. And that old man, I was finding out, all he had to do was look at you, could see the whole picture. And yet he was a very simple old fellow. So he made a nice phrase there. He said that search and see only the beauty in man or that in human beings and around you. Do like the lotus which grows up towards the light, disregarding the mud from which it emerges. So we have to work with the mud, but this beautiful flower can eventually come forth. And that was a nice thing. Finally, behind it seems to me that the underlying question, almost all therapy, is why am I here? Which is Gabo's program. Is there any purpose? I mean, so many people are barely struggling to keep their heads up above water. And with our great North Korean leader now, every one of us owes about 20,000 to the banks. And mortgages, all that nonsense. And is there not something more to life than that? Just striving to succeed economically and just keep your head above water. I'm finished now. Don't worry, relax. One last statement from Viktor Frankl. Today's man's will to meaning is frustrated on a worldwide scale. Ever more people are haunted by a feeling of meaninglessness, which is often accompanied by a feeling of emptiness, or as I'm used to calling it, existential vacuum. And that's all these young girls getting drunk before they go out, all the drugging, all those substitute behaviours. And I think therefore our society is, the main part is going towards more degradation, but then there's an increasing stream of people who are saying, I don't want to be part of this anymore, and starting to grow vegetables, and some of them are physicists going out growing their vegetables, and I have to make my bread this afternoon. So that's it. I don't know if that's of much interest in.
Before I sit down, a small presentation that Ian just wants to make, just a token of
What?
our appreciation. Ian just wants to give his token there of our appreciation.
I didn't want to be taking anything.
You're not getting anything.
Okay.
It's funny, exactly. When I wanted to get something for Ivor, I made a few inquiries as to what he likes. There's not a lot of things he does like, right?
No, I don't need anything.
I know, and he doesn't need anything. I was told that as well, right? So after checking with 3 of his close women in his life,
I have a whole lot of lovely women,
I
including
know, and including Carmel as well. He said, well, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't really go out with women as such, you know?
Oh, but I love them.
I know he loves. I was told that. I don't want to tell everybody that. So, but he does have a love of jazz music. So what we got was a voucher for you to buy all the jazz music that you would like.
Oh,
and I'd like to say, on behalf of everybody here, a very big thank you.
God bless you. That's lovely. Yeah, that's one of the few things I won't open it yet, told you.
You have been listening to the Professional Hypnotherapist Podcast, a production of the European Association of Professional Hypnotherapists. That's EAPH.ie. Why not pop over to EAPH.ie and discover the many qualified and experienced therapists waiting to hear from you right now. Thanks for watching and listening. I have been your host, Aidan Noon. Bye-bye for now and take care.